If you think this is new, unusual, exceptional, let me disabuse you. What we are experiencing is a visitation from the past. It is the new normal, and it will be the new future. It's the last 40 or 50 years when we haven't had this, which is exceptional. Throughout history, there has always been vast tides of history, vast tides of people pushed ahead of pestilence, famine, war. 7 million in displaced people's camps. After the Second World War, the flotsam and jetsam washed up where they were left, absorbed into their societies. It's now come back to revisit us, and it will be about our future too, because if you think the tide of humanity now knocking on our door is big, wait until global warming takes effect. Not long ago I was in Kuala Lumpur talking to the ASEAN nations who are already seeing and beginning to plan for the 4 million people who will be displaced after the sea levels rise by a metre, which they're reliably predicted to be going to do. They're dealing with that as a region, and that brings me to my second point. There's no way that you can deal with this except in a European context. This is our region. You have to have a Europe-wide policy. And therefore, I believe our government's policy towards this is both morally questionable and extremely stupid, because we can't even deal with the 3,000 knocking on the gates of the Channel Tunnel. If we do not deal with the migrations moving into Europe, their solution is also ours. And instead of resting on our side of the 20-mile wide moat that separates us from this, by the way, probably a 50th as wide as the Mediterranean, which people aren't having difficulties getting across, instead of sneering that the rest of our Europeans, feckless bunch, are having difficulties coping with 1 million when we won't even concentrate our mind on 3,000, we should be joining them. In the end, they will stumblingly get there. At least they are trying. They will find the means to deal with this crisis. And that brings me to my third point. I think if this is about the future, this is a new geopolitical fact of our life, and in the end we're going to have to find the policies to deal with it. I have a suspicion that in the next 5 to 10 years there will be an international conference that draws up new rules, new regulations. Good heavens, we might even have to revisit the definition of an asylum seeker. We will definitely have to visit, I'm told that's 2 minutes and I have 3. We'll definitely have to visit how we separate the hangers-on, the piggybackers, from the genuine asylum seekers, and I suspect we're going to have to find a new definition for those who are neither asylum seekers nor economic migrants, but have had their homes taken away from them by global warming. In the course of that, we will give great opportunities for those who some of us don't like to sing the devil's songs. It will be a battle for humanity against those which we might lose unless we're very careful. But if you do lose it, then I have no doubt whatsoever that you will add refugees to the already numerous reasons why wars exist on our planet, of which I believe, and you may do so too, that we already have an over-sufficiency.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Next up is an advisor on migration and human rights at the United Nations, there at the High Commission on Human Rights. For her perspective, Pia Oberoi.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to reflect a bit on migration, because it is the empowerment of a young woman able to earn a living for the first time in her life. It is the hope that a community places in a young man sent abroad to provide a lifeline for those back home. It is the story of innovation and entrepreneurship of migrants, the ideas and the knowledge that they bring, and those that they take back home with them. But today, as Paddy has pointed out, the predominant story of migration is one of exclusion and inequality. Refugees forced to flee violent conflict and persecution, migrants compelled to escape what the United Nations Secretary General has called silent crises, grinding poverty, environmental destruction, hunger. The desperate, precarious mass movements that we are seeing today are by no means truly voluntary, and juxtaposing deserving against undeserving human beings ignores a complex reality. Too many people are being forced to leave their homes and communities in search of security and dignity. Most of them are not in Europe, nor are they coming here. But Europe cannot any longer remain aloof from the global crisis of mobility. Many European countries are in demographic decline, with aging populations and a shrinking workforce. Europe desperately needs more young people to run its health services, contribute to the tax base, and look after its elderly, because increasingly Europe's societies are no longer self-sustaining. And overwhelmingly, migrants are not looking for charity. At the same time, local populations deserve a more accurate picture of migration and not a series of badly drawn caricatures. For sure, there are few easy answers, but the solution to the chaos and suffering we see at land and sea borders lies in governing migration intelligently and compassionately, not embarking on futile efforts to prevent it at all costs. The universal principles that bring us together as human beings must surely be the basis on which responses to the current migration crisis should be built. Governing migration fairly means upholding legal obligations to respect the human rights of all migrants and refugees, acknowledging the real needs of labor markets, particularly in the care economy and low-skilled job sectors, and crafting entry systems that protect our values as well as our borders. Migration policy must be premised on evidence and compassion, not on misperception, stigma, and fear.
Thank you. Thank you. Next to give his perspective is a speaker who joins us from Hungary, where he is the Director of Research at the Századvég Foundation. It's a conservative think tank, which is the official advisor to the Hungarian government on this subject, on matters of migration. So with his opening perspective, Balázs Orbán.
Thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, I have to start with a clarification. Although I came from Hungary and my family name is Orbán, and we are the official advisors of the current Hungarian government, I'm not a relative of our Hungarian Prime Minister, so it's just a coincidence. But I wrote some thesis sentences for you. I think we Europeans are responsible for the current stage of the migration crisis. Although migration is a neuter expression, some shape of migration is positive and some is negative. The humanitarian assistance is an obligation of all the countries around the world, although it doesn't mean that we have to receive everybody as a refugee, and it means that a form of humanitarian assistance cannot be formalized or standardized. So I think the mass flow of people is, right now we have a special form of migration. So we Hungarians, we have a special Hungarian expression, it's called that population migration. So it's a mass flow of migration. There is no English expression like this. I haven't found it, so maybe you're better in that. So it's a special form of migration, what we have now. And this special form of migration is a serious problem for all the EU member states and needs to be stopped because we Europeans lost control. Control means, I'm teaching constitutional law, so control means sovereignty. Europe lost sovereignty in this situation. And if we do not take immediate action, the current crisis will threaten most of our commonly shared values, as you heard about the threatening of the EU as an area without internal borders, which is already threatened. And I think that first of all, we should make two steps. We should accept or agree on a package. First part of the package is that our politicians, the body language of our politicians need to be changed. The external communication of our body language, of the body language of the politicians need to be changed. And secondly, our legal system right now is catalyzing or galvanizing the whole process. So we have to change the legal system. Why am I saying this? Because just imagine the situation that you are in Afghanistan, you are in Bangladesh, or you are in Africa. You don't have the chance to start a new life in the European Union legally. So you will never get a visa to arrive to Europe and start a new life there. It doesn't matter whether you are a refugee or a migrant. The only chance you have is to move on from your country of origin, walk around the continent, not cooperate with the transit countries, arrive your receiving country, and there apply for an asylum. And if your asylum is granted, then you will have the chance to stay in that country legally. If not, then you will send it back. I think it's nonsense, and this is anti-human, this current process. So we have to stop that. We have to regain our sovereignty, and then we can talk about migration and then the refugee issues as well. Thank you.
Okay. I just want to clarify one thing there. You said that having to stop. Does that mean your advice to the government of Hungary when it comes to the number of refugees or migrants who should be allowed in, is your advice that the figure should be 0?
No, well, it's a different problem. The problem is that what we were facing in Hungary, that we are not capable of registering the people because there is a massive flow of people. So first of all, we have to change the whole legal system and legal regime. And then we can regain control and make a decision whether somebody is a refugee and somebody is an economic migrant. And that's the second question, what we think about immigration. So, but that's a different situation. We are confusing things in Europe right now.
All right, let's go to our fourth speaker, known to many of you here, leading British politician who held the roles both of Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary, serving in the governments of Margaret Thatcher and then John Major, and maintaining a close interest in foreign affairs. With his perspective on this question, Sir Malcolm Rifkind.
Thank you very much. Let me begin, if I may, by responding to one of the questions that Jonathan asked. As a grandson of a migrant, I have no difficulty saying that migrants can very often make a very valuable contribution to the country that receives them. That is very straightforward. I want to concentrate my opening remarks on the question of asylum seekers and the current crisis, which involves not hundreds or even tens of thousands, but millions of people who are entitled to think of themselves as refugees seeking asylum. Some of the facts are not controversial. It is not controversial that people have a right under international law to seek asylum if they are being persecuted. Secondly, it's not in dispute there are several million people, mostly Syrians, but not just Syrians, who can claim that entitlement at the present time. And I think thirdly also, I have no problem with the proposition that the United Kingdom and Europe must accept a share of the obligation to meet that requirement. But let me move into slightly more controversial territory. The first point I would make is that the vast majority of the Syrian asylum seekers are no longer in Syria. There are many who are in Syria, but I'm talking about the 2 or 3 million, perhaps even more than that, who are mainly in Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon. And at this moment in time, they are no longer suffering persecution that has made them asylum seekers. They have asylum, although not in very agreeable or attractive circumstances, and with no certainty as to their long-term future. But they are not currently at risk to their lives because of the government and the country from which they have left. Second point, people have rights of seeking asylum. They neither have nor have ever had a right to say, and I want to go to this particular country, and it is unreasonable and unacceptable for that country not to accept me. There is no such legal entitlement. That is a matter for both the receiving country and the asylum seeker to reach agreement on. And thirdly, there is no specific British or European obligation that doesn't apply to the rest of the world. The treaty obligations we all operate under are universal obligations, and therefore if there are millions of people seeking asylum, this is not, as it's so often described, a challenge to Europe. It is an ethical and legal obligation for all the civilized countries of the world to share in responding to this burden. And the final point I would make in these opening comments is, in addition to that, there is a very real question as to whether the best way when you're dealing with millions of people who are living very close to their original country, many of whom will want to return to that country, most of whom are actually, of these refugees, are exactly the sort of people their own country needs even more than the rest of the world because of their professional skills and their other educated qualities. We have to also look at ways of allowing them to remain as close as possible to Syria, which will require billions of pounds or dollars of help from the international community, but and also a change in the rules that at the moment prevents them even being able to work when you're living as a refugee and an asylum seeker. That is absurd and obviously causes maximum discontent. So there are a remedy of solutions, but I conclude by saying it is not either ethically or legally correct to imply that there is a uniquely British obligation or European obligation. All the past problems, such as at the end of the Second World War, led to millions of people going not just to Europe, elsewhere in Europe, but to the United States, to South America, to Australia, and in the case of Arab refugees, the Arab states themselves, many of whom are incredibly wealthy, should be accepting their share of the obligation also.
Okay. Let me, before we hear from our last speaker, I just wanted to follow up one thought there. It's partly about terminology. Those people who have fled Syria but are now in the neighboring states, as you've described, whether Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey, what's the right way to describe those people? Should they no longer be described as refugees because they are no longer in an urgent situation of seeking refuge? How would you describe them?
They are refugees because they have not yet got any country, including Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, that have given them permanent right of residence. That is why, under the stupid rules at the moment, they're not even allowed to work.
But you would want to distinguish between those and the person fleeing Syria for their life.
I am simply saying that they are not at the... If you are in a refugee camp in Turkey, Lebanon or Jordan, it's a pretty unpleasant experience. But it is not one that means you continue to be at threat to your life. The things that made you a refugee in the first place.
I understand. I just wondered if there's a way in the language where we could have a word that distinguishes those two situations, but maybe we just don't have it. Let's hear this, our last speaker with some opening thoughts, and then we're going to obviously get into discussion. The fifth perspective on this question comes from the rabbi of New North London Synagogue and the senior rabbi of the Masorti strand of Judaism in Britain. He lectures widely, writes widely, and with his perspective on this question, please welcome Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg.
Let me begin with a human obligation. I was in Calais at the camp there with a range of interfaith leaders, and I was rather worried that we would be tourists of disaster, but people wanted their stories to be heard. And a man from Sudan, he called me over to his tent, which I wouldn't even call a two-person tent, and he had sleeping bags, some blankets. It was very cold in there. Two people could just about squeeze in, and since then the weather has become cold, and it's wet, and it's raining. And his situation reminded me that by the age of 16, both my parents were refugees from Nazi Germany, so this is an issue very close to home and moral home in the Jewish community, though not that alone in particular. And my father, when I was 16, took me aside one day and he said, just remember, do your schoolwork because you can take everything from a person except what's in their mind. And what struck me actually about these refugees, he once said, I'm a medic, I'm a computer scientist, is actually their minds have been taken, or the capacity to use them have been taken from them as well. And from the point of view of human compassion, there is an obligation of collective care. How that pans out among countries is a secondary and a clearly important question. And there's very widespread goodwill. I've got at least 4 NGOs operating or being led from my own community. So that's about compassion. Then there's a question about what's equitable and intelligent. One couldn't, from the point of view of Jewish history, not have in mind, as there have been European conferences about who will take whom and how many and the disagreements, have in mind the Evian conference called by President Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor in France in the summer of 1938, at which not only did virtually no country say they would take a greater number of people fleeing Nazi fascism, it actually allowed Goebbels to say in Germany, well, they complain that we don't like the Jews, but they don't want them either, which led almost directly to the escalation of violence against them. So there is an obligation, seems to me, to find an equitable way of sharing across humanity the care for what is a part of our own family. The last thing I want to talk about is long-term, and this was already said before. I'm very nervous that the terrible events in Paris 10 days ago will eclipse the coming events of the climate conference in Paris. But it's very clear that the less of the world's surface is habitable, the greater will be the number of refugees. And therefore we need to act the best we can against both warfare and environmental degradation in the long-term interests of having as much of the earth livable home to people as possible.
Thank you. we've had the sort of opening perspectives. Let's just, as I said, get into some sort of freer and open discussion. I'm just going to pick up with something with you, Balázs, and then I would like others to come in on this. Your government's position, anyway, was, and you know, in September, several countries voted against the move that would have seen refugees allocated, as it were, across Europe. In late September, there was an agreement that 120,000 refugees would be, if you like, distributed across the European Union. 4 countries voted against: the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. Who does Hungary imagine will take in these immigrants, these refugees rather, if Hungary won't? I mean, what is the... There will be plenty of countries that think it's difficult to take in refugees. If each country says, well, we don't want them, who does your government and other governments imagine will take them in?
It's not an economic problem. The problem is that they don't want to stay in Hungary. They want to go to Germany and to Sweden, and because they want to go there because they are invited. So that's what's happening.
And welcome, perhaps.
And well, actually, I think the situation is changing rapidly, but used to be welcomed for sure. And I would like to talk about, and we cannot do anything against that. We also have Hungary. We also have humanitarian obligations. We are participating in a UNHCR relocation programs. So we welcome refugees directly from Syria, the same as what Great Britain is doing right now. So, but that's another story, what's going on right now. I want to talk about shortly...
But I suppose what I'm saying is, you know they can't live in Syria because it's become uninhabitable, that country, because of the war. So where should these people live, do you think?
They should live in neighboring countries.
Paddy Ashdown.
I just was a bit confused by Malcolm, if you'll forgive me, because he's usually so very clear. He rightly differentiated between those who are in fear of their lives, are genuine asylum seekers, are desperate and losing their own lives and losing the lives of their children, fleeing across the oceans and the dusty and rainy, muddy roads of the Balkans to get to us, and those who are living perfectly safely in camps, not comfortably but safely, who are not asylum seekers, who are indeed close to the country where apparently Malcolm wants them to be. So if that's the case, what is the logic for the government to say it will only help those who are not in desperation in the camps and refuses to take part in the European programme to help those who are genuinely desperate and asylum seekers? Is it the word Europe that sticks in your craw?
Not remote, if I may answer.
But the government is helping those who don't need help in preference to those who desperately need help, by your own definition.
Yeah, I know. If you let me answer, there's a very straightforward reason for making the distinction. I think one of the most unwise consequences of Angela Merkel's offer to take 800,000 is it has not only fueled the existing movement, it has encouraged literally millions of people who perfectly rationally would prefer to live because of the prosperity of Europe in Germany or other European countries. It has encouraged millions of people, not just from Syria, from North Africa as well, from Somalia, from Eritrea, and from, I could give a dozen other countries, to say, well, as long as we can get to Europe, there are countries that are willing to take us. And therefore, there's a difference between people fleeing from Syria in a dangerous way, crossing the water, and risking their lives. That I have total sympathy for. But people, hold on, people who are no longer in Syria, who are living safely in Turkey, if they choose to cross dangerous waters, risking their lives, they are doing so because they prefer to live in Germany than to live in Turkey. Now, I don't criticize them for doing that if that's what they wish to do, but they do not create an obligation on the countries of Europe to take every one of the millions of people who may make that decision.
Okay, thank you. Paddy, before you come back, because I want to make sure there's other people here. In that situation, though, Malcolm, if they have been made the crossing and it's dangerous and they're in the water and rescued, where then should let's say it's an Italian ship that rescues them or a Greek ship, where then should they be taken?
Well, I accept we are now faced with a de facto situation. We have to make sure that these numbers are not swelled by further hundreds of thousands, which is exactly what will be happening as we speak. If we do not reach agreement, not only as to how we are going to give refuge to those who are in Europe, but how we are going to have simultaneously a policy that says so far and no further.
Okay, I know Paddy wants to get in, but I want to hear other people. Pia, this idea that we heard Balázs articulate, that actually the right place for those people is in the surrounding states, what's your reply to that? Is the right place for these people Lebanon, pretty stretched, I know, but Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, etc.?
The average time a person spends in displacement, a refugee spends in displacement, is 17 years. That's just the average time. We have people that are born and bred and grow up in refugee camps. The Syrians that have been sitting in Jordan, Lebanon, and then moved on to Turkey, have not been able to access the bare minimum of subsistence for themselves. We have talked to people that have moved on because they haven't found education, decent education for their children, healthcare. And I think this really speaks to the beginnings of the refugee regime. The refugee regime was crafted in 1951. It was crafted at a time and a place where persecution was the reason for movement. Civil and political rights were privileged over economic, social, and cultural rights. The idea of somebody moving because they saw no future for themselves, they saw no future for their family, was somehow put in a second tier. But what we are seeing now is precisely people saying that that's not the way that we can live our lives. We don't have the right to work in Turkey, in Jordan. We have no education for our children and no healthcare. So in a sense, this is what you're seeing. You're seeing the culmination of a governance system that is in desperate need of fixing.
Jonathan Wittenberg, this thing of, you spoke in a kind of moral language about this subject. Would Britain, say, discharge its moral responsibility to those people who have made it out of Syria but are in the neighbouring states by funding them to have a more comfortable life in a refugee camp in Jordan or Lebanon? Or is the moral obligation the only moral thing to do to actually welcome them into this country, this society of ours?
It seems to me there is a question about justice and about what is equitable. I can't see how a long-term solution is going to be accepted across the world when some of the poorest countries are expected to take the greatest burden. And therefore, both in terms of supporting refugees who've arrived at bordering countries and in accepting appropriate numbers, I know there's going to be a discussion as to whether one can define that or not, would be part of a country's obligation, in my view.
Could I comment on that?
On that exact point.
Yeah, I think part of the answer to your question is that a country like Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon needs not to be expected to fund giving a proper standard of living to the refugees in their midst. They need and deserve billions of pounds, dollars, euros from the wealthier countries to enable them to do that.
Okay, so Hungary, you said, Balázs, that you wouldn't want them coming in there, but you thought the places they should be in is those neighbouring states. Would Hungary write the cheque to make it easier for Lebanon and those other places to receive the refugees that you wouldn't want actually in Hungary?
Yeah, well, actually, we are doing that, and we are supporting the hotspots outside the EU. So from outside the EU, they have the right to apply for an asylum. That's a humanitarian obligation also, but we are encouraging them to march through Europe. It's actually ridiculous, and we are not only talking about Syrians, because that's a very different, very special case because of the military conflict. We are talking about Africans, Bangladesh, people coming from Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Pakistan. So these countries are beehives of instability and poverty and economic conflict. What we should do with those people? That's millions and millions of people. Should we allow them to enter the European Union without any control? I don't think so. We have every developed country on earth has a humanitarian obligation to have those people somehow. But it doesn't mean that we need to have them like immigrants.